If it seems as if you've been hearing about the trade dispute over softwood lumber for decades, well, it's because you have. And it made a big comeback this year thanks to the new U.S. president's decision to slap tariffs on that Canadian timber. Why has this been such a sore spot in relations with our largest trading partner for so long? Let's ask Harry Nelson. He's a professor in the Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia, and he joins us now on the line from Vancouver, BC. Harry Nelson, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. How you doing?
Fine, thank you, Steve, and good evening to you.
Let's just start with that question that we posed in the introduction. Why has this thing persisted for so long?
I think there's really two simple reasons, Steve. One of which is there's a lot of money to be made when these disputes happen, and that's a very powerful incentive to kind of keep them going. And I think the second part of it is there's just a lot of confusion, I guess one would describe, as to kind of understanding how things actually work in Canada when you're down in the States. And I think that's something that kind of gets exploited in this dispute.
Well, let's start there, because there are really two different regimes under which both countries operate here. In Canada, it's the federal and provincial governments which own about 90% of the forests, I understand. And in the United States, it's private landowners that own pretty much all the forests there that get logged. This is obviously a significant difference. I want to know, though, why that's such a big deal in all of this.
You know, when I've looked at this and written about it, I think that it comes down to some very different views of how we as Canadians see government and as Americans. And I think that in the US, there's really been this adoption that, markets know best. And so, we see it in a lot of aspects of kind of how people talk about the role of firms and the role of government. Well, in Canada, we're much more comfortable with see government being proactive and government being capable of doing things well. And, I guess the easiest analogy, even though it's an overworked one sometimes, is, we can just look at the how we view healthcare and the role of government in supporting that, and kind of the fraught debates they have in the U.S. around there. And I think that kind of encapsulates the some of the differences in, when Americans look north of the border and just don't understand why government should even be involved in forestry.
Okay, that's a good analogy. How about this then? How does the Canadian government determine what it's going to sell its product to the United States for? Well,
the main way that we charge fees for timber harvest on public land, and it's usually going to be provincial land. There's not a lot of federal land. That's usually where we have timber harvesting taking place, are through these kind of timber fees called stumpage. And it depends on which province. Each province has its own unique system. All of them are trying to determine what that market value of that timber is. When we're harvesting timber in Canada, most of it is going to lumber, but it may be going into other products. It may be going into newsprint, it may be going into pulp, maybe going into plywood. We may export some of it as logs, but the majority of it goes into lumber. And the majority of it that goes into lumber, the majority of that lumber gets exported down to the US. And there, virtually most of that timber is going into either US home construction or renovation.
Let's just, for devil's advocate purposes here, take the American position for a second and look from their perspective north of the border, where they see governments owning the product, governments potentially selling the product to Canadian business interests, maybe at a reduced rate in order to let them be more competitive, and then those Canadian businesses, having purchased the product at a reduced rate, then selling them into the United States with that built-in advantage. Now, that's how they see it. Are they wrong to interpret the business transaction that way?
Yes, I would disagree with that, because at the end of the day, what we just described here is Canadians sell into a variety of markets, and we compete with a variety of countries. We compete with the US, we compete with Scandinavia. And so we are, ultimately the value of our timber is derived from what we can essentially, the selling price of our products. And so we can't charge more for the timber than it's actually worth, because all we would do in that case is it really wouldn't influence how much we're selling. We'd just be reducing revenue to the Crown.
In terms of calculating how much wood each tree can produce, is there a difference between how we do it and how they do it?
Yeah, this is one of these sort of arcane kind of mysteries of the softwood lumber dispute. On one side of the border, we use a cubic meter measure. We're all familiar with what a cubic meter is, and when we talk about how much timber is being harvested or how much stumpage we're collecting, we'll talk about it, in terms of dollars per cubic meter. Americans tend to use something which is the board foot scale, and there's several different versions of it. It's an older system. It kind of goes back to the 1800s. It's less precise in the sense that the numbers that you use when you're trying to predict how much lumber a log can produce will vary depending on the size of that log. And I can give you a simple analogy here, which is, if we think about what trees look like in Canada, they'll be small, they'll be skinny, you may have maybe a 2-inch diameter or a 4-inch diameter by the time you get to the top of the tree. And you think about, take that small, skinny cylinder and how much, basically square pieces you can get out of it. That's how much lumber you're going to get from that log. And so, our cubic meter system kind of can take that into account. When you go down to the States, what they're doing typically is they may be using measures where they're going to have that log, rather than being a small, skinny cylinder, may be a much more larger log. Or it may even be tapered in the sense that, it's fatter at the bottom and skinnier at the top. And what that really means at the end of the day is, as you start thinking about expanding that log, you can get more square pieces out of it. And that's where you start to get these range of these different conversion factors. And that becomes then both not only a kind of a source of contention, but it's also sometimes where a lot of the calculations, when the Americans start arguing that we're paying less, actually stems from using this wrong conversion factor.
Okay, I'm beginning to get the picture here. So we've got mostly Crown land, they've got mostly privately held land. We do it by the metric system, they do it by the kind of the old imperial system. It's no wonder we can't find the sweet spot of consensus on this thing. So tell me this, how many times over the last few decades has Canada been slapped with softwood lumber duties that Canada feels have been unjustly applied?
4 times. This time would be the 5th time.
And what are our options when we've been hit with these kinds of duties? What do we do then?
Well, our options now, as they have in the past 3 rounds, have been to use the various kind of dispute resolution panels we have under NAFTA, the Chapter 19 panels. And that's, again, what we'll be doing here. Our other option is to appeal to the World Trade Organization.
All right, let's start with NAFTA. I always thought, now correct me if I'm wrong here, I always thought that softwood lumber was not in the actual North American Free Trade Agreement, that we somehow got an exemption from that. Is that true, first of all?
It's not directly in it in the sense that when the Free Trade Agreement was signed back in the 80s, which is kind of where NAFTA came from, there was an agreement over how lumber was essentially going to be enter the U.S. And remember, the Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA were really about trying to kind of remove all the tariffs from the majority of goods and services flowing between the countries. And so because we kind of had a special deal around lumber, it was, sort of put to the side, but at the same time, kind of like the supply management system, we sort of still had the ability to ship into the U.S. and to kind of use the other parts of NAFTA, like the dispute panels, to kind of resolve issues. And in fact, that was one of the important things that Canadian negotiators at the time, looking at the potential for trade disputes, felt it was a priority to be able to make sure that there was some effective way of being able to address even then what they saw as a risk of trade protectionism. One of the things to kind of note here too is that at various times over the past 35 years, which is how long these disputes have been going on, there have been times when an agreement has expired, or we haven't actually started litigation yet, and lumber actually does enter the U.S. duty-free. So we have these brief moments that free trade breaks out, and then the whole thing falls apart again.
All right, if NAFTA is a process that we either, do or don't use, or don't like, on those occasions when we don't like it, because of what the Americans are doing with their duties and so on, is it another option for us to go to a different trade regime, namely the World Trade Organization, and seek remedy there?
We can, and we have in the past, and typically, and I would imagine we'll do it in this one, we will actually start appeals with both venues. Now, the challenge with the World Trade Organization is with the WTO, they will look at these rules. They'll look to see whether they're compliant with the obligations that the US and Canada made when they signed on. And if they determine that the US, these trade actions, these duties, whether they're, are not consistent with it, they cannot ask the US to remove those duties. What they can do is they can tell Canada, all right, this is how much damage the US is causing you. We'll give you the right to impose a similar kind of duty or some kind of trade action on something that the US is exporting to you. So it becomes in some ways a kind of like, well, we can't fix it directly, but we'll let you, essentially kind of compensate yourself by causing equivalent damage somewhere else. And that becomes a challenge to try and identify, well, first of all, do you really kind of want to do that? And second, where might you actually choose to kind of those kind of trade actions? Because at the end of the day, we'll typically harm ourselves more than we will necessarily kind of the countries that are, the US kind of firms that are exporting to us.
Harry, I don't mind saying, it sounds awfully messy. How does anybody operate under such strange procedures?
Oh, Steve, it has been, I'm amazed. Over the years when this comes up, there are people within firms, people within government that become just consumed by this file. And I've often thought it's a shame that probably so much time and energy, at least on the Canadian side, has gone into kind of trying to manage this as an issue, rather than thinking what one would normally think about in terms of business terms, like how do you develop new products? How do you kind of go after new markets? And it, as you probably can gather from their little kind of digression into thinking about what a log looks like, there are a lot of rabbit holes that people can go down here.
Well, we thank you for coming down our rabbit hole here at TVO and joining us on the line from Vancouver, British Columbia. Harry Nelson, professor in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.